Hello everyone, Prime here, and I hope you've had a great day. Now today, I'm going to present you with a choice. Would you become a vampire from the Witcher 3 universe? Or not? Vampires are a diverse group of monsters within the Witcher universe. The most common types appear as bat-like creatures with large claws and sharp fangs. Well, teeth, which are only significantly less deadly than the whole claws thing, depending on the type of vampires. There are several types of vampires, but usually they can be grouped together in one of two tiers, the lower tier and the higher tier. The lower tier vampires are usually appearing as the bat-like creatures, which is the natural form of all vampires, or most vampires at least, and they behave a lot more like monsters than humans. They typically will live away from human societies within their own territories that they establish for themselves, and most of them can be found in rather dark places. This is probably due to the fact that vampires technically within the Witcher universe do suffer from a weakness to the sun, though most of them, by the time of the current storyline, the time of The Witcher 3 for instance, don't actually suffer from the effects of direct sunlight, or sunlight generally. Now, lesser vampires aren't exactly the nicest of chaps, because they feed on blood, but not for malicious reasons necessarily. They do this to survive. However, one of the entries describes these vampires as ripping apart their victims and then feeding on whatever mess they've just made, instead of the whole traditional napping on someone's neck and then sucking blood like that. That is believed to be a way that they might do it within the Witch universe, but it's established as a myth that a lot of the common people, the peasants, and some other people within the universe believe. Now, a common type of these lower tier of vampires are the Ekimmara. They're fast, very quick, swift opponents. Apparently, thanks to the fact that they have this fast speed and exceptionally large claws, they can tear through certain types of armor if they get enough strikes in. They're also somewhat larger than your average person, and of course do appear as sort of bat-like hybrid style monsters. Giant bats that walk without wings, essentially. Another variation of the lower tier of vampires are the Fleder. They're much smaller and like to attack from the air, but they're still pretty deadly, and are apparently said to be fearless, so I wouldn't want to mess with a Fleder anytime soon. Now, moving on to the higher tier of vampires. These guys are very distinct from the lower tier because they are credited with being much more intelligent. They're also a bit more scarce than the lower tier of vampires, but one of their types is called the Catachan. Now, depending on the Catachan's age, they can be considered a lesser vampire or a higher vampire. Mostly they're considered higher vampires. Now, one that we find in-game who was actually doing some fairly messed up stuff took the form of a human and pretty much lived amongst the people of Oxenfurt, which is one of the main cities in The Witcher. And he lived there for about 200 years without being detected by anyone, until, Geralt comes along and does his Witcher stuff and, shall we say, beats him up. Let's go with that. Another high tier of vampire is called the Higher Vampire, funnily enough. They usually appear as humans, are much harder to detect than other types of vampires. Witches' medallions can't detect these higher vampires, and they can freely live amongst people. Unlike a lot of other vampire types as well, they don't need to drink blood in order to survive, and in fact, they can drink blood. It's like a pleasurable substance to them, like weed, or gummy bears, or caffeine, or gummy bears. So whilst they, yes, could get caught if they went on a rampage or rave and just drank as much blood as they possibly could in a very short span of time, as long as they don't do anything silly, they really could live amongst human society happily and live very comfortable lives. Because yes, they can survive on human food. That said, blood doesn't exactly send them on a weird trip, but it does give them a bit of a strength boost, a power boost for combat. On top of all of this, these vampires still possess their natural bat-looking form, and are immune to silver and fire. Silver and fire are the main ways, or some good ways, that you can kill the other types of vampires, but these guys say no to that. Even if you manage to defeat them in combat by chopping off a bunch of their limbs, for example, given enough time, they can actually regenerate all of the things that you take away from them. Also, they're kind of sort of immortal. So yeah, that might be a problem if you actually wanted to hunt one down. So whilst they, yes, could get caught if they went on a rampage or rave and just drank as much blood as they possibly could in a very short span of time, as long as they don't do anything silly, they really could live amongst human society happily and live a very comfortable life. Coming back to vampires generally though, there are a lot of myths about vampires that exist within the world of The Witcher. Because yes, they can survive on human food. Also, contrary to popular belief, holy water, crucifix, and garlic do nothing to vampires. Also, steaks, whilst I'm sure a vampire wouldn't be pleased if you just stabbed him or impaled him with one of those wooden objects, won't actually kill them, even if you put one through their heart. Now, with all of this said, it's not exactly all fine and dandy living as a vampire in the world of The Witcher. First and foremost, the world of The Witcher is pretty much for the most part dominated by humans, and a lot of humans have certain prejudice towards things that aren't humans, or things that don't occur in the world naturally, i.e. the monsters. So if you were ever discovered to be a vampire, if you were, say, a higher vampire, well, that sucks for you, because the way that non-humans tortured or dealt with once discovered isn't exactly pleasant. But if you can't die, I suppose it wouldn't be too bad. On top of this, if you're not a higher vampire, well, you've got to watch out for fire and silver, as well as witches generally. You know, the monster slayers that are kind of the title of the game. Yeah, those guys can really mess up most vampires' days. Also, some of the notes in games say that if you separate the parts of a vampire or certain types of vampires, such as the Ekimara, you can actually defeat it like that. So using explosives, such as a lot of the bombs that you can craft in the game, probably isn't the best thing to concern yourself with as a vampire. Now, of course, for a higher vampire, if you can just live amongst humans and there's no way for a normal human to figure out that you're not exactly 100% human, you don't really have anything to worry about. You've just got to keep the whole blood addiction on a low and make sure that no one sees you doing any vampire stuff if you ever want to do that. I.e., don't transform into your bat form around most people, any people. Probably for the best. And higher vampires probably sound like god tier characters, but they can actually be defeated by other higher vampires. And by defeated, I mean killed. But then again, higher vampires are extremely rare within the Witcher universe. But then again, those higher vampires probably would live together, as they do in the story of Blood and Wine. So, apples and oranges, I suppose. All things considered, there really doesn't seem to be that much risk necessarily associated with being a higher vampire. If I got to choose which species of vampire I'd like to be, then I'd probably pick the higher vampire and choose to live as a vampire. If it was randomized, well, there's a chance that you lose your sentience, your anything that makes you an intelligent human being. Essentially, you become a mindless beast, just roaming around and living to survive. I say become, but I really should mention that all vampires are actually born as vampires, and vampires don't exactly spread their sort of race, continue the bloodline of their race by biting people or infecting people. They're literally a distinct species, like human beings, or wolves, bears. So there's that. Assuming that you become a lesser vampire, not a higher vampire, but I think it's a fair risk because, well, you'd gain immortality. And assuming that you have other higher vampires that you know, then you wouldn't necessarily be alone for eternity, which is, an argument that you see pop up when people talk about not wanting to necessarily be immortal. I mean, if you actually know other people around you would also be immortal, it wouldn't be nearly as bad, right? Especially if you'd also distance yourself from society, knowing not only of the risks, but of course knowing that other people in society will eventually die. And supposedly, time loses a lot of meaning to higher vampires. So that's a thing to consider as well. Let me know what you think though. Would you actually want to be a vampire in the Witcher universe? And if so, tell me what type of vampire. Pretty interesting to see what you think about that in the comment section below. I'm going to try and do more games on the channel and cover more lore on the channel that isn't just necessarily Smite, mix things up a bit. But still, of course, post that alongside Smite content. So, we'll see how that goes, and if you enjoyed the video, go ahead and leave a like, always helps out, I appreciate it, and subscribe to the channel if you're new and want to see more content just like this. But, till the next video, have yourself a very good day. I have been Prime, I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye bye.